Have you ever heard of a skinwalker? I've avoided telling this story before because I want to believe that it wasn't real, that it was just a dream. But I've read so many similar encounters that I feel like maybe I should tell someone. Maybe it was real, and something like this really lives out there. I wish I'd known it was possible back then. The story starts at my aunt's house. At the time, my mother and father were going through a divorce. I was about 11, and my younger sister was only 6. The details of the divorce don't really matter, but we were staying at my aunt's house with my mom until she could find a place she could afford on her own. My sister and I were too young to fully understand, so it was almost like a vacation. It helped that my aunt had a really cool house. It was big, and it seemed even bigger to a couple of kids. I don't really know house lingo, but it was very modern, with 2 long main wings. One side housed the bedrooms and a small library. The other had the kitchen. The kitchen had these huge windows, the kind that lots of modern-style houses have when they take up the whole wall. Nestled in this wall of windows was a sliding glass door, but my sister and I rarely used it because it was large and heavy and hard for us to open. Another thing about these windows, though, was that they faced the woods. My aunt's house was surrounded, right on the edge of a large wooded area. The trees ended only a couple of feet away from where the sliding glass door was. Of course, this was one of the benefits of our house. Living near the woods was peaceful, or at least that's what my aunt said. My aunt had a small sitting area by the windows where she could watch nature. She told us that oftentimes she had little herds of deer walking through, and that she even seen a mountain lion once. Anyways, you get the idea. It was a big house with big windows and it sat close to the woods. For the majority of the time that we lived there, we had no issue. My sister and I would even go play in the woods, always staying inside of the house. My mother would often sit in the sitting area by the windows and keep an eye on us. We'd play hide and seek or tag or see if we could climb the trees. Things changed at night though. I hated those windows at night. When I walked down the long hallway to the south wing of the house to get a glass of water from the kitchen or something, I'd always see the trees moving, swaying unnaturally. Not like from the wind where it started from the top and worked its way down, but like something was pushing against them from below and the tree shook from that. It freaked me out, but I was only 11 so it wasn't that hard. I usually just hurry up and get my water and run back to my room. I hated it so much that I rarely forgot to get water before bed after the first couple of times. Wasn't risking that creepy shit again. Later on, I wasn't given a choice though. One night I had a dream that my mother was calling me. Her voice was coming from the kitchen, asking for my help with something. I stood up from bed and made my way towards where she called, my brain fuzzy from sleep. Her voice was soft, but it carried to me as I walked, warm and familiar. The closer I got though, the weirder it sounded, becoming slightly distorted and deeper. It was like a mix of my mother's voice with some animalistic cries that just got louder until I was shocked awake. Just before I stepped through the doorway into the kitchen, I quickly looked around, confused. My mom wasn't there, and the whole house was dark except for the moonlight that illuminated just enough of the room for me to know it was empty. I shrugged it off as a sleepwalking dream, though I'd never had one before, so I turned around and walked back to my room. A few nights passed before it happened again. This time it was my father who called me. "Please," he called. "I need to talk to you. Come here." Just like last time, I stood up from my bed like in a trance, aware and unaware of what I was doing. Each step brought me closer to the kitchen, where I could hear my father, his voice becoming more gravelly and broken as I walked. I stepped into the kitchen and thought I saw him there, standing by the kitchen island, illuminated in the moonlight. He turned and looked at me, and I woke up, realizing there was nothing there at all. It took a few days again, but on the third night I heard my little sister. She was crying for me, telling me she had hurt herself and needed my help. I stood up and started hurrying to the kitchen, like every big sister. This time I barely noticed when her voice started changing, becoming a distorted gasp as I drew closer. I stepped into the kitchen and saw her. She was knelt crying on the ground near the windows. I started to walk over to her but stopped when I realized something. She was kneeling behind the glass. She was outside. Her cries became a laugh and I startled awake, but I still saw a shape kneeled outside the window. Only it was bigger and dark and misshaped. I screamed in terror and it moved, faster than I'd seen anything before, disappearing into the woods. My mother came running from her room, turning on the lights and comforting me. I told her about the sleepwalking and passing, so she chalked it up to me just still being asleep when I told her about the monster. She walked me back to my room and had me take some sleeping medicine to help me get back to sleep. After that, everything seemed like it might be okay. A week passed and then two. My mom found a nice apartment that she planned to move us into. My sister and I were sad to leave, but I was secretly relieved. I've been on edge every night since it happened, wondering if it would call me again, but everything was silent until the night before we were meant to leave. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard shuffling outside my door. I froze, certain that the monster had returned from me, that it had somehow gotten in the house and was about to open my door, but the sound simply moved past me and down the hallway towards the kitchen. I stayed where I was, waiting to make sure it wasn't a trick, then got up as quietly as I could and crept over to the door. I hovered, unsure if I should open it. After a few seconds, I made up my mind to run to my mom's room and wake her up. I slowly cracked open the door and peeked into the hallway towards where the sound was coming from. There at the end of the hallway and shuffling into the kitchen was the form of my little sister. I blinked and then squeezed my eyes shut and opened them again, making sure I wasn't asleep. But no, she was real, and she was disappearing into the kitchen right before my eyes. As I realized this, I realized I could hear something, a kind of faraway moaning whine coming from the direction she was going. Dread ran up my body, and I looked down the hallway at my mom's door, the opposite direction that my sister was walking. Fear told me to run and get her first, but instinct moved my feet towards the kitchen, where my sister had gone out of sight. I ran as silently as I could down the hall and peered around the doorway to look for her. There she was. She was standing right in front of the windows, her eyes open but glazed. As I watched, I realized the trees were swaying, the same way they used to but much faster now, and the swaying seemed to be getting closer, moving towards us at an alarming speed. I could hear branches breaking and the trees creak and protest as something hit them, and the moaning whine I had heard from far away was getting louder, sounding like a dying animal. One tree was rocked so violently, a flock of birds flew screaming out into the night air. As this was happening, my sister was reaching for something, the lock on the sliding door. Even at 11, I knew something was coming through the woods towards us, and it was running, sprinting, right at my sister. I ignored my brain screaming at me to run the other way, and raced towards my sister. The noise was all-encompassing now. It had become a screeching so loud, it sounded like it was all around me. I grabbed my sister around the waist, pulling her back before her fingers touched the lock, and I pulled both of us behind the wall beside the window, just out of sight. The sound stopped. The trees no longer swayed, and the screeching had fallen silent. I could hear my sister breathing frantically, but I held her mouth closed, willing her not to cry. My own breathing was shallow and fast, but as I tried to quiet it, I realized there was another sound. My sister's breathing, my breathing, and the even breathing of someone, something else, standing just outside the window next to us. A too large humanoid shadow blocked the moonlight that usually fell into the kitchen, and I watched the figure reach out its unnaturally long arm. I held my breath as I heard a scratch against the sliding door and saw the shadow of the creature's arm touch where the handle of the door was. After a second, the creature withdrew its arm and let it fall to its side. Then it stood there, still, for what felt like hours. Finally, the shadow shrunk and I could hear whatever it was leave. The underbrush rustled and the trees swayed, but the sound moved away this time instead of towards us. Still, I didn't move. I waited until all traces of its presence was gone before I slowly pulled my sister away towards the hall, keeping out of sight at the window as much as I could. My sister was crying as I led her down the hall. I think I was squeezing her hand too tight, but I felt overwhelming relief as I opened the door to my mother's room and crawled into her bed. My mother never believed us, of course, and we moved away the next day. I refused to return to my aunt's house ever since, and she eventually moved away. I've never had an encounter like that again, but that might be because I stay away from the woods like a plague now. If you're a fan of hiking or camping or live near nature, all I can say to you is, good luck.
I have a story. It isn't mine, but it happened to my uncle. He used to tell me this story when we went camping, and it scared the lights out of me every time I heard it. We live in Utah, and my uncle, Mark, went on a mission at 19. They sent him to a reservation in Arizona. They paired him up with a companion named Carl. When they first got there, there was a huge rift with the locals on the reservation, with them being there. They didn't want my uncle and Carl staying on the reservation grounds. Eventually, they came to a compromise that they would stay on the outskirts in a trailer. This reservation wasn't very big, and it was located next to a heavily wooded area. The first night, they were trying to sleep, when all of a sudden, their trailer started to shake violently back and forth. Startled and not sure what was happening, they climbed under their table for cover. Mark could distinctively hear someone pushing it from both sides of the trailer, kind of like a group of people. After about 5 minutes, it stopped. The next day, they made rounds on the reservation and were talking to the locals. Carl made a comment to one of the families that their trailer was shaking the night before. The family got very quiet and then told them they had to leave. They thought it was strange, but didn't think much of it. The next night, it happened again. They awoke to their trailer shaking back and forth. Again, they climbed under the table until it stopped. This went on for 2 more nights. Anytime they tried to talk to anyone about it, they got quiet and told them to leave. Mark started thinking that, due to the tension of their arrival, the locals were doing this to scare them off the reservation. They then go into a convenience store, and they were talking together about how frustrated they were with the situation. The clerk overheard and said, "They can't talk about it. It's forbidden." Confused, they ask him, "Can't talk about what?" The guy continues to tell them about the Skinwalkers. He says they are evil demons that were once Native American witches. If they talk about it, the Skinwalkers will come for their souls. They just walked out of there baffled. They thought it was another scare tactic. So that night, when the shaking started again, my uncle decided to be brave and confront them. He went to the trailer door, threw it open, and yelled, "Hey!" When he did that, he saw these 3 animals run off. 2 were a wolf and 1 was a bear. but they looked strange, almost with human features. As he watched them run towards the trees, all three stood up on two legs and walked slowly towards the trees, making a human cackling laugh. It scared him so bad that they called their mission president the next morning, and they asked to be moved. They were relocated that day. For a year, nothing happened. One day, they announced that Carl was being relocated to another city, and Mark was getting a new companion, Jimmy. They had to drive for about an hour to pick Jimmy up from the airport. The road they traveled went through the boundaries of the reservation. They arrived at about 8 p.m. and met Jimmy, and they go to leave. The mission president tells Jimmy, "We are driving through a dangerous area at night, so we can't make any stops. If you need to use the restroom, you need to go now." Jimmy says, "I'm fine." The mission president gets serious enough to even freak out Mark. "I'm not kidding. Go do your business." Jimmy was insistent he was fine, so they hit the road. As they were about 30 minutes into the drive, they were going through the area of the reservation boundaries. Jimmy starts complaining that he needed to pee badly. The mission president says, "We can't stop here. You'll have to hold it." Jimmy keeps going on. "I really can't hold it." So the mission president stops the car and says, "Okay, but you will do your business next to the door. And if I say get into the car, you better get into the car fast." With a look of confusion, Jimmy says, "All right." He opens the door and starts to do his business. About 5 seconds later, the mission president says nothing and just yanks Jimmy into the car and floors it. Jimmy and Mark start freaking out. What's going on? The mission president says nothing and just increases his speed. All of a sudden, Mark sees something next to the car on his right. A giant wolf-looking man was running on 2 feet next to the car. Mark looked at the speedometer. They were going over 60 miles an hour and still increasing. The wolf creature kept right next to the car for 10 minutes until it finally took off into the trees. Shaking, Jimmy gets out of the car when they arrive. There was not a word spoken through the whole ordeal. And Jimmy says, "What did I just see?" The mission president says, "Next time I tell you to take care of your business, you take care of your business."
What did I see? Looking for answers. I had some more weird stuff happen last night. I took 2 of my dogs for walks. I normally walk Finn, large all-black German Shepherd, towards the park where I've had these experiences, and I walk Booger, a Chai Terrier mix, the other direction towards downtown. On my walk with Finn about a block away in the direction I was headed, I saw 3 or 4 deer walking calmly towards the park. Most nights where something weird happens to me, starts like this. The deer seemed completely unbothered by me as I approached. They kept walking towards the park but stopped every few steps to look back at me, as if they wanted me to follow them. Then, as Finn and I reached where the deer were, I noticed about 10 or more other deer waiting as well. They all start walking together, calm, but still look back at me every few feet. On my way towards the park, I smell the stench of rotting meat. I know the smell very well as I used to be a butcher. It was strong, like someone plugged my nostrils with rotting ground meat or something. At the same time I smell the stench, I get the chills. Finn's hair stands up and he gets more nervous. I can feel the air around me get colder. As we continue walking, I look down the alleyway that cuts the block in half, and if you would walk down the dark alley, would spot out where I would eventually walk back home. I was 2 blocks away from the park. When you can reach the park, you can either turn around and walk down the same road. You can continue into the park, or you can continue on the road which turns left. Looking down that alleyway, you're looking at the part of the road that continues left, which is the way I take every night on my way back home. What I saw, I tried to convince myself wasn't real. Or maybe I saw something else and my brain tried to convince me it was this. A large, muscular, pale, hairless creature that was moving fast. So fast I could barely see it. I saw the motion down the alley about 2 blocks away. The exit of the alley on that side of the street had light directly above it. It wasn't standing still. It was moving, and it was moving fast. The only reason I'm positive what I saw wasn't a deer or something normal is because of something I saw later that night. Something I will write about when I talk about my walk with Booger. It solidifies what I saw was something I wasn't supposed to see. In the meantime, I convinced myself I was making stuff up and being a pussy. As we approached the tree line of the park, the large group of deer moved to the side of the street where the neighborhood is. While I'm on the side of the tree line, I noticed something in the clearing. A lone deer, separate from the large group across the street, staring directly at me. I had my flashlight pointed at him, and I even hung up my call with my wife to use my phone to take video of this moment. This lone deer doesn't even have micro movements for breathing. The other deer across the street were constantly readjusting. You might be thinking to yourself, oh yeah, deer do that with bright light shining at them. Deer in the headlights always act like that. Just wait. Finn starts to pull very hard and acts anxious, nearly knocking me over. I turn to look across the street towards the large group of deer for at most 3 seconds, before quickly turning around to face the lone deer again. In those 3 seconds, that lone deer is easily 30 feet closer to me. Still not moving, staring directly at me. I have this on video. I have taken pictures. I felt weird. I felt unsafe. I have lived in rural Iowa all of my life. I am and have always lived outdoors. This didn't feel normal. I was scared. I back away while shining my light at the deer. Once I get a block or so away, he finally turns around and calmly walks into the tree line. The whole way home I feel like I'm being stalked, not just watched, but like something is following me. Here's a link to that video of the deer getting closer to me.
I saw that weird shit that one night. A couple months ago. Oh god. Dude, we were pulling way too hard. He's being weird. My dog is. Yo, what the fuck? He got closer, I swear to god, bro.
Now I went home and sat for a bit and tried to talk myself into believing it was all just a coincidence. After nearly 20 minutes, I started to walk Booger, my smaller chai mix. The entire walk was nice and very enjoyable actually. I had my earbuds in and was talking to my wife about what I saw in a joking way. Man, I'm such a pussy. I really scared myself for no reason, I said. At the end of the walk, I turned to go down our alleyway. As I leave from the garage on our walks, I stopped speaking from what I saw on the opposite end of the alley. My wife heard me stop. I want to preface this with, I don't have any substances, including alcohol for weeks up to that point. The most I'll ever do in that apartment is a few beers, or I'll use some weed to ease my anxiety if life is getting hard. I have no mental conditions that will cause me to hallucinate. The most I have is a personality disorder, resulting from trauma that I've been overcoming quickly this last year. I saw 2 large, muscular, pale, hairless creatures walking like apes at the end of the alleyway. The same thing I thought I saw with Finn, this time not going fast, much closer, and it felt intentional. I saw them walk across the street very slowly, staring directly at me. These were not deer. They didn't have long faces like deer. They didn't have fur or tails. They didn't walk like deer. They weren't slender like deer. My first thought was honestly that I was looking at two hairless male lions in the middle of Iowa. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, well after they had left my sight. 15 seconds later, I finally get the courage to walk the few feet into the garage. When I take my first step, I see a third one, slowly meandering across the street, staring at me. Booger noticed him too, and started growling. I ran to the door and watched the garage shut all the way. The entire night, Finn guarded the bedroom door. He never does that. He sat staring at the door all night. Booger stared at the windows all night. He never does that either. This happened to me yesterday night, Monday, May 13th, 2024. I don't know what to think.
This was about 4 or 5 years ago. Back then, I lived with my mother in a shed on a farm surrounded by woodland. Our farmland was a part of a larger piece of farmland that was split up and sold off, so we did have neighbors, though they were roughly half a kilometer away each. We loved that because of the privacy. It wasn't like there was nobody nearby I could go to if I needed help. That thought is what had me fearlessly walking alone at night between the hours of 7 to 8 p.m., sometimes fluctuating from earlier to later depending on the day. Sometimes I even went out on a walk at 2 a.m. in the morning because I was restless and couldn't sleep. Looking back, this was incredibly stupid, and after this incident, I never walked after 6 p.m. ever again, always making sure there was at least some sunlight left when I set out. The route I always took was a road circuit. The first part was out in the open in front of all the other farms, including my own. If anything had happened, at least one person would have noticed, and reception was pretty good, so I would have also been able to call someone. The second half, on the other hand, was concealed by about 200 meters of woods between the farms and the back road, stretching the full 2 kilometers at the back of the farm, and it was during that part of the walk when I had this creepy encounter. It was late at night. I can't remember what time exactly, but it was pitch black with the exception of my torchlight. I was about to approach the turn in the loop that would bring me out into the open again when I heard it. Help. It was this monotone voice that repeatedly asked for help. It didn't seem panicked in the least. I took my earphones out and turned my music off to make sure I was hearing correctly, but it didn't stop. Help. Help. A very stupid part of me almost responded, because for some reason my first instinct was, oh no, someone's in trouble, like a naive kid, even though I would have been like 16 or 17 at the time. Of course, then my brain kicked in, and I realized that approaching that voice was just about the stupidest thing I could do, so I started quietly backing away. Unfortunately, my cat had followed me on the walk and wasn't backing away with me. No, she was walking towards the voice, softly hissing. I remember desperately trying to get her to come back towards me without alerting the voice to my presence, just in case they hadn't noticed me yet. But I was getting scared and didn't want to stay there a moment more, so I ran forward and grabbed her. I then turned around and bolted back towards the house. I don't know if it was stupid of me to turn my back to the voice, as I was making so much noise while running that there was no way they didn't know I was there, and I had no way of knowing if they were giving chase. I was so fucking terrified that whole time. The image of someone cloaked in shadows chasing me entered my mind, and even though I couldn't hear anyone behind me, I never once slowed down until I was back safe and sound within my house. It doesn't end there, though. Despite how terrifying it was, there was still a part of me that was concerned about whoever it was, because what if they really had needed help? So I asked my mother to drive us to the location. Another very stupid decision, considering what we found. that being nothing. We called out and called out, but nobody answered. We didn't get out of our car though. Luckily, neither of us were that stupid. We drove home, having seen nothing and no one. But it still bothered me in the morning, so I had my mother drive us over again, and we searched the immediate area. Nothing. No indication that anyone had been there. There was no body, which admittedly was a drastic thing to search for, but I know shock can leave you eerily calm, which could have explained the voice and the lack of response afterwards, and that made me fear we'd been too late and we'd find a body in the morning. I don't know if I would have preferred this outcome, because at least then I would have had a face to the voice. But no, we found absolutely nothing, and to this day, I have no idea who that voice belonged to and why they were monotonously calling out for help. My mind has naturally come to some chilling conclusions and theories that leave me unable to sleep. Kidnappers, serial killers, all the classic horror stories. But I guess I'll never really know for sure.
Had a run-in while stargazing. Hi everyone. I'm shaking and panicking uncontrollably. So this started happening about 4 hours ago, and I've finally gotten home. So I want to write what happened while it's still fresh. To give a complete rundown, I live in Ontario, Canada, close to Toronto. I heard on the news that tonight would be a good chance to see the Northern Lights again. This past May, I went and saw them and wanted to take the opportunity to see them again. Last May, I went with a couple of buddies, but no one was available this time. The plan was to drive 4 hours to Algonquin Park, hike in the middle of the forest, make a campfire, smoke some Marlboros, and drive back after stargazing. I ended up driving about 2 hours there before my friend sends me a text, showing there's no real forecast of the Northern Lights. So I decide to go up anyways and stargaze, a hobby of mine. I drive up another hour, and at this point it's about 11 p.m. in the middle of nowhere. No signs of humans other than the road and the pitch black. I was on a call with a buddy since it was a pretty boring drive up, and I started mentioning how beautiful the stars looked. My buddy then recommended that I pull over and take some pictures to send. I end up pulling over, turning off all the lights in my car while leaving it running, and standing beside the forest. For about 5 minutes, everything was fine, as I was admiring the stars, gushing to him about it. Right about that time, the forest went completely quiet. There was literally zero sound other than the wind and trees. I immediately felt like something was wrong, and went to grab my flashlight to see if there was a bear or something. I walked a bit into the woods and turned on my flashlight. I ended up hearing a rustling noise and turned around to see this thing standing on its hind legs with bright orange-red glow to its eyes. It was about 50 meters away. I start mentioning what I'm seeing to my buddy when all of a sudden, my signal goes dead. Before I stare at it for a second until it starts sprinting at me at full speed, I immediately go into fight or flight and dash to my car, going in and redlining it until I'm doing about 300 kilometers an hour. I'm usually a pretty casual guy and not spooked by much, but I was shaking, crying, sobbing and trying to run away as fast as I could. Before anyone says anything, it wasn't a bear or anything similar. I start spam calling everyone and anyone until I can get a hold of my best friend, and start crying and sobbing about what had happened while freaking out. At this point, he just wants to check in to see if I'm okay and whatnot. I start describing to him what I saw, and use the name of the subreddit. I don't even want to say it in text, to describe what I saw. It was this super unnatural looking thing, and it had really spooked me. Right around here is where I feel all the muscles on my body start becoming sore and cramping up. It turned out when I had initially dashed to my car, I basically output all of the force I could to get away. I'm an ex-rugby player / powerlifter, so my instincts were forcibly making me get out of there as fast as possible. After about 30 seconds of saying the name, I see the same figure on the side of the road, following me with its head and glowing eyes. I proceed to hyperventilate and freak out more until he calms me down and tells me to get the hell out of there. I started looking for a way to make a U-turn, but I couldn't find anything. At this point, I drive another 15 minutes before I can find somewhere to turn without stopping. I start to slow down and U-turn before I hear this ear-splitting scream sound from my window, before I gun it back the direction I came. I start freaking out more, telling my friend as everything was happening, before I started getting a sickening feeling in my stomach that something was watching me. I started to look all over the empty roads and see nothing. All of a sudden, my signal goes out again, and I hear the screaming sound and kind of see a humanoid body in the fetal position on the side of the road. I then see its head look up at me and stare directly at me. I gun it again, and I can't get the goosebumps and sinking feeling to stop. I continue trying to contact everyone I can, to no avail. I end up trying to calm myself down with a Kanye CD and hear something tapping on my sunroof. I don't know how long I knew, but I knew something wanted me to open the sunroof cover and look through. I prevailed and never looked, but never lost that sinking feeling that it was there. I would hear the tapping sound on and off, rhythmically kinda sounding like drums, for about an hour until I reached a small town. At this point, I've gotten a hold of my friend and puked in my car. I'm just trying to get back as fast as possible, and he's telling me to describe Elden Ring lore to him to calm me down. After about an hour of paranoia, I stop crying and freaking out. I drive as fast as possible to get home, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still on me. I've locked all my doors and windows, and I'm still shaking like crazy. I don't know what to do, and I'm freaking out.
My 3-year-old son suffered from chronic ear infections last year, which led him to having high fevers. I slept with him on this particular night because I needed to give him Tylenol throughout the night to keep his fever down and to keep him comfortable. I set my alarm to wake me up at around 2:30 a.m. When I woke up, I went into the kitchen to get the Tylenol. I noticed a bright light shining into the apartment from our deck door, which also illuminated part of the woods behind the apartment. When I went over to see what it was, it turned out to be a car with those bright LED headlights in the parking lot to the far back right of the apartment. I figured they were dropping someone off. I saw the movement of what resembled a dog walking around near the woods. I started to think that the lady who usually walks her dog, a cute little corgi, in that area, purposely faced her car in that direction so she could see while she walked her dog. As it got closer, I realized that there was nobody out there walking a dog, and there was no dog. I don't know what it was that I saw, but I'll describe it in the best way I can. At first, it looked just like a dog, corgi size, but as it walked closer, it looked like your average house cat. Then it looked like a black bear, and then it looked like a koala. I live in New Jersey, and there are no wild koalas here. At this point, my heart is pounding out of my chest, and I'm scared. The fear I felt was like a primal type of fear that I've never felt before. I ran to my bedroom to wake up my boyfriend, and I shook him awake very roughly. I said, "You gotta come see this." He was a bit annoyed with me. When we look outside together, we see this thing getting closer, and it looks like a skunk now. White stripe down the center with a perky, fluffy tail. I said, "Oh, it's just a skunk," with a little chuckle. I felt a bit embarrassed that I woke him up over a damn skunk, but at that moment, I also felt relieved. However, I was mistaken. As it walked, it looked as if it was struggling to find a form. I thought it looked like it was falling apart, but also coming back together again at the same time. I know this doesn't make sense, but it's hard to find the words for what we saw. After the skunk formation, it looked like a person crawling on the ground with some type of fur or skin attached to them around the leg. Then it changed again, and it looked like a raccoon, groundhog, black bear, cat, koala, deer, and skunk. The part that stuck out to me the most was that whatever it was seemed to be coming apart or shedding, but at the same time it was growing. Whoever had their headlights on turned them off as it went deeper into the woods. This happened pretty quick. I'd say it was only about a couple of minutes from start to finish. My boyfriend ended up going back to bed, but I couldn't sleep after that, so I grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the woods to see if I could see it again, but it was gone. I also opened the door to see if I could hear anything, but I couldn't. It was very quiet. I had a very hard time going back to sleep that night. My boyfriend wasn't scared, but he was confused and stunned. He didn't know what to make of it. I was scared and creeped out. I know if I hadn't woken him up to see it for himself, he most likely wouldn't believe me and would have chalked it all up to me being groggy from just waking up, or possibly it just being an animal. Unfortunately, I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it.
Hey y'all, lurker, but I've never posted. I wanted to share my personal experience and get some validation that I'm not crazy. I titled this Possible because people never believe me when I share. So a couple years ago, my mom and I were leaving from a visit with my grandma. For reference, she lives in an old folks mobile park in the countryside of the town in southern Washington. It's completely dark out, and I'm driving the car with my headlights on. As we're taking the exit road, I slam on my brakes as what looks clearly like a coyote darts in front of my car. My mom and I both see it. It shoots to the left, and I follow it with my eyes as it runs into the field of cows beside us. My mom doesn't have great vision and lost it in the darkness, but I could still see it. Sharing this always makes people look at me funny, but this was the realest thing I've seen. The coyote stood on its hind legs and was much taller than a normal coyote would have been if it were to stand. Somehow between it running in the field and standing up, I noticed there were antlers on its head, like moose antlers. My eyes started to water, and I got the worst sensation flood over me, like get away now. I had goosebumps all over, and even though my mom didn't see it, she had goosebumps too, like her body knew something was wrong. I'm sure I'm not the only one to experience this. Has anyone seen something similar? This happened about 3 years ago, and I can still remember it very vividly.
I've lived in Southern California my entire life. If you know anything about California, it's very diverse. Up north is filled with mountains and trees, and the south is a lot more, well, city-like. This summer, I decided to take a trip to Lake Tahoe. It's a beautiful place, and my first time being upstate. I'm going to chop this story up into segments to make it easy. Day 1. I settled into the cabin at around 5 p.m. after an 8-hour drive. I was very tired. I went and laid down in the bed that was in the loft. It was quiet. It was like being in a different world. I was so used to cars zooming by and people talking right outside my house, but it was quiet. I fell asleep fairly quickly. Around 4 hours into my sleep, I jerked up. I looked around for a bit before hearing strange tapping. I looked around to see where it was coming from, but to no avail. It sounded like someone was tapping on the window part of the back door. I figured I was just paranoid and went back to sleep. Day 2, nothing happened this day, and I slept fine. Day 3, I woke up early in the morning, maybe 4. I heard a crash coming from the attic ladder that was placed conveniently right behind the couch I was sleeping on. I didn't move. I heard a few footsteps. You know that feeling you get when you feel someone staring at you? That's how I felt. I was on my side, staring straight ahead. Suddenly, I felt somebody or something crawl over me. I felt their 2 hands on either sides of me, and I knew their face was inches away from mine. Like I said, I was facing straight ahead, and I wasn't going to turn my face to see who it was. They stayed there for what felt like forever, until I felt them crawl backwards and then off the couch. I heard the dog let out a muffled bark, in which someone shushed her, then let out a "good girl." The presence stayed there for what felt like an eternity, until I heard footsteps going out the back door. Still, I didn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep. I checked on my friends a bit later on when I felt the coast was clear. None of my friends had left their rooms that night. I told them my experience, and they said I was being paranoid. I halfway agreed with them, and our day went on as planned. Later on day 3, after a day at the lake with my friends, we came back to a quiet and cozy cabin. The caretakers of the cabin told us there was a river a bit farther back into the woods, about a 15-minute walk. My friends decided to stay back and rest, so I took some bug spray and a small backpack with snacks and my phone. It was a pretty straightforward trail. There was tall grass on either sides of the trail. It was a thin path, but pretty easy to navigate. When I got to the riverbank, there were 2 picnic tables. I didn't want to get eaten by mosquitoes, but I stupidly wore sandals. I put my bag on the table and started my walk back to the cabin. For some odd reason, the path seemed distorted. What was once a straightforward trail was now covered in rough terrain. I noticed the tall grass on the side of the path had been disturbed. It was as if something huge, and I mean gigantic, had walked over the long grass. At first I thought maybe it was a bear, since the locals had told us bears were a problem this time of year. But the sheer size of it made me second-guess that. I was a bit taken aback by this. However, I continued and made it back to the cabin, then back to the river. I was a little frightened now. I kept telling myself I was just freaking myself out, and I should enjoy the nature. I sat down at one of the tables and watched the river. After a while, I felt like there was something staring at me. I looked around, assuming one of my friends was on their way to prank me, but there was no one. Across the river, I noticed a bit of brush that was shaken up. There was a clearing in the bushes that was fenced off by 2 logs in an X shape. The longer I sat in that spot, the more worried I got. I couldn't help but feel like there was something behind the thick brush that I couldn't see. I went down the river, hoping to come across some kind of life. But nothing. No fish, no frogs, no roads, just mosquitoes, and a bunch of them at that. Disappointed with the lack of anything really, I went to sit back at the table, and that's when I heard it. It was a noise I can't really describe. It was a scream, but a gurgle, as if whatever it was had a mouthful of water. It was inhuman. I froze. In the moment, I should have been running for my life, but I just froze. I heard rustling in the bushes behind me, the ones I was worried about earlier. Then, again, the scream. It was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Run. And so I did. I sprinted my ass through the forest. What should have been a quick trip back to the cabin was anything but. After about 10 minutes of sprinting, I noticed I was lost. I stopped for a few moments, frantic to see if I could find anything that looked familiar. I saw a bridge that I crossed on my way there, and I started sprinting. I thought to myself, why didn't that damn thing kill me? I had stopped for a good minute, but I could hear it chasing me. It was a fucking game for the damn thing. Every time I stopped, it would as well. I finally made it back to my cabin, and instead of going inside, I stood on the porch. I faced the forest, and I cried. I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I knew it was still out there. I didn't want to turn my back to it, so I sat there for hours, silently crying, occasionally checking my phone, and well, writing this. I don't know what the hell that thing was. The only thing I can even compare it to is a Wendigo. All I know is that I will not be going to that river ever again. If you could please shed some insight on what or who might have been out there, I would appreciate it. These past 2 days have just been too weird not to be connected. The last day of the trip, we burned some sage before heading to bed that night. My friend Brett came up to me around 4 a.m. and told me he couldn't sleep. We watched TV for a little while before again hearing taps on the back window. It lasted a few seconds and was sort of in intervals, if that makes sense. My friend Brett managed to get a video. We didn't check it out because, well, quite frankly, we were scared as hell. After about 10 minutes, the tapping stopped. Brett and I took turns sleeping. No other strange thing occurred that night. Brett and I were woken up by loud banging on the shed out back. We went to investigate, and there was nothing there. I'm leaving in 2 hours. I'm so excited to get back to the city life and leave this place and all its weird shit behind. Probably against my better judgment, I went back to the river to take some pictures. Something very strange happened while I was out there. I really can't explain it. It was loud gurgling noises and soft music. I was pretty deep in the forest, and there was no one out there with me. I got back to the house and had my friend Brett go up into the attic, while myself and the others watched from below. There was nothing up there. I'm not sure if I feel better or worse knowing there's nothing up there. I did find some sage under the cabinet, which makes me wonder if it was there for a reason.
I figured I'd post this here to get some thoughts after I've terrified my wife. I want to preface this, that I've hunted and hiked in the region since I was 9 years old. I'm very familiar with the wildlife and the sounds of the forest. I'm not really a believer in any of this sort of thing, but I don't really have an explanation for what happened tonight. I hiked about 1.5 miles through the forest and swamp, hunting deer today, and got to the pocket of wood and field that I wanted to be in and climbed a tree hunt out of. By all accounts, this was an uneventful afternoon and evening until sundown. For about 30 straight minutes, I listened to a rabbit be tortured and just wouldn't die. If you heard a dog or hawk or hunted rabbits, you know what I'm talking about. When they are distressed, they scream bloody murder. And this seemed to continue forever. Naturally, this can make you on edge, but I figured a hawk got it and just wasn't killing it. Then, the sound of a twig snapping and silence. The rabbit stopped. Through the thicket I could make out a figure, vaguely deer-shaped, moving through the woods about 35 yards away. So I grabbed my bow, but the undergrowth is far too thick for me to pick out much more than a rough outline. It walked behind a tree and disappeared. The sun is now fully set, and I'm in the last 15 minutes of post-sundown light, and I hear, in a flat, emotionless child's voice coming from where the deer disappeared. Help, help, No fluctuation or distress to the voice. Not said as if it was asking for help, just a statement. Help, help, help. It probably said it 15 times, and then the woods went silent. There wasn't even a breeze to make a sound. Then, a crack of a limb of a tree snapping and all hell broke loose in the woods. Squirrels, birds, and deer suddenly shot out of the woods, like bats out of hell, sounding like an absolute stampede through the forest. And then, silence again. To make things worse for me, I lost my hat-clipped light on my walk in and had to haul ass a mile and a half through the woods, back to my truck in darkness. My path only light by tonight's full moon.
I live near a very large, very populated national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the goings-on near here. Strange sounds, strange creatures, and strange disappearances. I have dealt with these myself in the past on hikes, and even just relaxing in the park. Here is one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house that's deep in the boonies. The only road to there is a gravel road that's pretty much washed away, so without a good car, you're not getting out there anyway. My cousins lived in a trailer with their moms right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games, which mainly involved me getting chased. I was the youngest. My grandma was in the hospital with my aunt, so our older cousin, Dee, had to watch us. Dee was, and still is, the only cousin that's older than us that we still hold in high regards. He would mess with us and play around, but actually cared about us. The whole day we spent playing around, but we would usually play more at night. Things like hide and seek and tag and whatever else. We had been playing pretty far away from the house, and it was starting to get dark. We decided to go back to the house and grab flashlights and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being hunted. I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property and hid behind a log. I heard my cousins getting close, so I ran, and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property line, almost a mile from the house, and we saw my cousin, Dee. He looked at us and kind of growled, and we all ran away from him, thinking it was a game. We ran back onto the gravel road, and we saw him walk out of the tree line, but he did it weird, kind of gloatingly in a way. We ran into the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door, but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it too. As we loudly scooted the table across the floor, Dee came into the living room from the master bedroom, rubbing his eyes. We had obviously woken him up from all the movement, and he was mad. We had told him about seeing him chase us, and he got wide-eyed. He told us to go to our bedroom and stay there. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, and he came in and told us not to worry, that it was just him scaring us, and we went on with the night. It wasn't until about 3 years later, when I was 13, that he had told me the truth. It was a skinwalker. He told me that he's dealt with it when he was our age, and he proceeded to tell me his story. I may share this someday, depending on how far this goes. This is, of course, just one story. There are a lot more.